Good evening. Thank you for thank you for joining us. I'm Sharon Wyatt, librarian for the Chicago Public Library Adult Services Civic, Cultural, and Literary Department. And on behalf of everyone at Chicago Public Library, welcome. Tonight's event is a part of our Voices of Justice speaker series, a slate of programs that will engage with authors and thought leaders who spark conversation on justice. The series builds on our library's rich history in curating events that are responsive to the interests of our communities. Today, we are pleased to welcome Jetta Grace Martin. She will be discussing her debut book, Freedom, the Story of the Black Panther Party. She will be in conversation with Mays Jackson. Mays Jackson is a political strategist, media personality, and urban marketing pioneer. He has a diverse background of experience in business, politics, and community engagement. Mays has over 20 years of experience lobbying for high-profile clients, creating community-based solutions, and driving the discussions that shape the policies of urban communities. Mays has featured on ABC, CBS, the New York Times, Chicago Sun-Times, and other high-profile media outlets. Most recently, Mays hosts the Mays Jackson Show, which airs every weekday from 3 to 6 p.m. Mays' show is noted locally for its willingness to challenge the local power dynamic by openly asking the question, what's in it for the Black people? Mays is married to Metropolitan Water Reclamation Commissioner Carrie K. Steele and is a proud father of two, Alon, daughter, and Maison, second, his son. During tonight's program, we'll be monitoring an online chat for questions from the audience for a brief Q&A following the conversation. So please feel free to ask questions during the discussion. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Mays Jackson.
Thank you, Sharon. And I want to say what an honor it is to be here today and a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Chicago Public Library. Thank you to the commissioner. And thank you especially for inviting me here. I got to tell you, I am more than excited for the opportunity to talk to our guest today. I'm going to tell you the book was scintillating. I couldn't put it down. And it was one of those pleasure to read books. That when you get a hold of it, you just don't put it down until you finish it. I must tell you, it went everywhere with me. I'm on vacation right now. It went with me to the beach. It went with me on the porch. It even went with me to the bathroom. It was that good. So let me just say, I hope that I don't embarrass her, but she did an awesome job. And it is my honor to welcome here today with us, Jetta Grace Martin, one of the co-authors of Freedom, the Story of the Black Panther Party. Welcome, Jetta, to our conversation today. I'm excited for it.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here too. Thank you so much to the Chicago Public Library. I'm really looking forward to this.
Awesome. Well, let's just jump right into it. I'm going to start with the fact that you wrote this book, The Story of the Black Panther Party. And I really want to, before we even get started, I want you to tell me, I have your biography, but I'd rather you give me your autobiography. Oftentimes people will read the biography as Sharon did for me, but I think sometimes it's often for an author, I'd love to hear your autobiography. So give me the story of Jetta Grace Martin, how we got to writing this book, and then we'll go from there.
That's going to take all of our time. I'll try to give you a condensed version.
I'll take it.
Okay. So I've been writing ever since I was really young. I started kind of basically just writing, telling stories since I was a really little person. I first started writing on my dad's blue typewriter, because people didn't have computers in their homes.
Typewriter?
Yeah, I know how to use a typewriter. So it was like a blue typewriter that I would write my stories on. And luckily I've progressed because I had this phase where every story would start, it was a dark and stormy night, like every single one, no matter what the plot was going to be. But, kind of throughout my life, I would go into bookstores and I would look at the bookshelves or into libraries, two of my favorite places, bookstores and libraries. And I would think, one day I'll be here. Like one day I'll see a book with my name on it. And so it's just an incredible moment to actually see the book in someone's hands, or my friends took pictures of it when they got it and sent it to me, or to see it in a physical bookstore. It's just such an amazing feeling. So I have kind of been writing my whole life, but my profession, I guess you could say, for most of my professional life has been dance and choreography. So I'm a performer. Yeah, so that's kind of who I am. I guess I went to Harvard. I went to New York for a year to try to make it in New York. And then I came back home to the Bay, and I've been dancing here and choreographing here. And I've done works with the Museum of the African Diaspora. Just like a few weekends ago, I performed in the SF Jazz Festival with the amazing vocalist Kim Nally and her band. So we were jamming, I was dancing, and they were doing their thing. So yeah, that's me. I'm so happy like to just have it and I can hold it and just like know that it's out there. And for a creative person, it's just to be able to have this physically like this is just such a joy and an honor and a privilege. And like now I'm talking to all of you. That's kind of surreal, honestly, but I'm enjoying it.
Well, let's go back, because I gotta ask, how does a dancer become the author of the story of the Black Panther Party? Like, how does a dancer, I was looking at your bio and I said to myself, that's why I said I'm going to let you give me an autobiography. Tell me, how do we make the leap from being a dancer? And obviously you speak of the diaspora and dancing. And so obviously African-American studies and Black history is obviously woven into you. I believe your parents are also teachers, professors as well. But tell me, how do we get from dancing to the author of the story of the Black Panther Party? Make that connection for me.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Bay. So I'm not too far from Oakland. So I've known about the party. My dad is a professor of American history, and my mom is a professor of anthropology. And so I have known about the party and about the history for pretty much most of my life, not to the extent that I learned about it through, researching for the book. But in terms of being a dancer and a choreographer, I think it's actually a very, it makes sense. I like to call myself a creative communicator. And when you choreograph, you're basically just telling a story, but with movement. And so it's very similar. I had a high school teacher, I was feeling all fly. I made a dance and I was like, oh, it's so cool. I'm going to show it to her and she's going to be all impressed. And she said, oh, that's nice, but it was just steps. And I was like, oh, like, what does that mean? So she said, you need to think about the connections between the steps to really make it into a dance. And I think it really applies to writing. As I was writing the book, I was thinking, okay, sometimes I would spend a really long time just on the words I was using and how they sounded and the broader picture that they created. So I think that dance and choreography actually is a lot of the skills I use in dance and choreography, I definitely used with the writing of the book, just like movement and pacing and that type of thing. In terms of how I came to write this particular book, even though the way the book is, it looks like Waldo E. Martin Jr. might be my son. He's actually my dad. So, yeah, his name comes third, but he's my dad. So Joshua Bloom and Waldo E. Martin Jr. are the other co-authors, and they wrote Black Against Empire. So that's like a comprehensive history of the party for adult readers, and like very scholarly and academic. And I don't know, I have it next to me, almost 500 pages or more, right? And so they were approached to write a young adult kind of like history of the party. And so they were kind of trying to figure out how to make that happen. And so fortunately, my dad, one day, it's actually a little funny. One day he kind of turned to me and he's like, what do you think about this? Like, I know you want to write. Would you be willing to do this? And I'm like, okay, sure, I'll try. So that's how it came to be this particular book at this particular time. I'm a little more of a novelist at heart, to be honest. And so that did come through too with the way I wrote this book, because I really wanted to feel like a page turner. Clearly I can't make anything up, no Martians or meteors or anything. But yeah, so I have a bunch of novels, right? But then I thought, okay, sure, like I'll try to tackle this. And I had no idea what I was getting myself into though. Yeah, I had no idea.
How long did it take you? So when you say you had no idea, how long did it take you guys to put this book together?
That's kind of a tricky question to answer because the scholarship and the research that Josh and my dad did were like, over a decade, right? The book that they published. And then with this particular book, it had been in sort of the idea phase for a long time. But I would say I really started going like working at it, shipping away really, really intensively. I guess I would say in like beginning 2020, end of 2019. So this particular book, that's how long it took. But I feel like what it's coming from is like years in the making.
Got it. So it was your dad had already drafted a larger publication. This was essentially the page turner that we all needed to be able to read to catch us up to speed. That would, for somebody who probably is not going to want to read the scholarly version of the breakdowns to the microscopic area, to those very technical words, this felt very approachable to me, if I might use that word. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that makes me really happy to hear because my dad and Josh, they're both academics as well. And so sociology and history. And so, it's a very different type of book. And technically Freedom is a young adult book, but I read tons of young adult books. And so I wanted it to be the kind of book that people of all different ages could pick up and read and make it feel really accessible. That's partly why I started it. It's largely written in like historically, like the chronology, but I started with like a vignette to try to draw people in that isn't necessarily like the party began in this day. It was like an action scene, basically. Yes. I also love movies, right? So it was an action scene and I wanted people to think, oh, and then want to read more. So.
Okay, so let's get into the book itself. Talk to me about it's odd to me. Why do you think that the Black Panther Party started in Oakland? And I find that, if you think of where something like this would start, I think of a city like Chicago, a bit, maybe even if it's in California, I think of Los Angeles per se, which we saw was very important throughout the book. But tell me, why do you think the Black Panther Party started in Oakland, California?
Right. So I think this is an interesting question because I feel like Oakland is a very particular place. And so we were talking about this a little bit before. Huey was born in Louisiana and Bobby was born in Texas, but they were part of the Great Migration. Like their parents moved looking for more economic opportunities. And so they moved to Oakland, to this area. And so I think that Oakland in a way was like a lot of other cities. The initial approach was armed self-defense against police brutality against Black people. So we know that happens in so many cities. So that wasn't particular to Oakland, but the way that they sort of, what is the word that I want? Harness the energy that existed throughout the country was particular. And to your point, as soon as people started to hear about the Panthers, branches started sprouting up all over the place because it wasn't that it was only like an Oakland thing, but it happened to start in Oakland. Not to say that there isn't a rich history of a lot of different things here. And they both studied at Merritt College and learned under people who kind of expanded their minds about like, anti-colonialism and like capitalism and what are we really fighting against and what is it that we really want. And so not to say that there wasn't a rich and particular thing in Oakland, but I think that in a way, if it had been different people in a different place, it might not have been the Black Panther Party, but something similar could have sprouted up because these conditions are existing in cities throughout the country.
Got it. So talk to me about, I think, and that goes to a broader point that I wanted to get to. Talk to me about the Panthers and why they seem particularly to transcend the times. They had a lot of peer groups during that time, right? There were a lot of pro-Black, you had SNCC, you had SCLC. I mean, you had so much going on. Why did the Panthers, in your estimation, catch fire the way that they did? I liken them to a supernova. But talk to me about, you talked about those conditions. How does that fire that sparks in Oakland spread across the nation and become, by far, I think, probably the most iconic image of Black power throughout everything? I think if you probably got to say Dr. King, Malcolm X, and then you got to say the Panthers, right? In the pantheon of Blackness post 50s. How come the Panthers?
That's such a great question that I cannot completely answer in this amount of time. And probably I as a person can't completely answer because it's very complicated, but a few different things are coming to mind. I'm reading an interesting book called Healing Resistance, A Radically Different Response to Harm. His name is Kazu Haga. And so it's about the Keynesian nonviolence school. And it's interesting because he has this quote from Gandhi. So we all know who Gandhi is. And it says, quote, "I do believe that where there is only a choice between cowardice and violence, I would advise violence." So this is Gandhi we're talking about, who was like one of those huge figures of nonviolence. And I think at this particular time, what was happening is that, so you have the civil rights movement. And I do want to say, I feel like sometimes there's a disservice done to sort of make it seem like the civil rights movement, like you were saying, SNCC, like all these things are so separate, like nonviolence is so separate from armed self-defense. Everyone's fighting for Black liberation and Black freedom, just with different means and in different contexts, right? But so this was particularly, the armed self-defense against police brutality was really speaking to people at this moment in time. And so I feel like that's partly why it exploded in the way that it did. So, Huey Newton is like, he studies the law books. He knows how far away he needs to stand and can openly display his weapon. And people were like, I have never seen this before. Like, I have never seen anything like this. I mean, I'm not going to use expletives because it's the public library, but Eldridge Cleaver was like, oh my God, like he was like, that's a bad, right? He's like, look at this person doing this and standing up in this way, and I feel like that really, for a lot of people, that was something that they hadn't seen, and it really felt empowering and freeing. Like, there's something that we can do about the situation that we're in. We can change the situation that we're in. We can take power into our hands and we can change the situation that we're in. And so I think that really spoke to people at that particular time. I think part of the lasting power of the Panthers is that in their theoretical underpinnings as well. So this idea that it's not, Bobby Seale has, some quotes about like, it's not, we don't hate white people, we hate racism, right? It's like, it's not that this group is trying to fight for all oppressed people. They're connecting themselves to people internationally. There was an international part of the party in Algiers. They're connecting themselves to, there was a Young Lords Party, the Rainbow Coalition. So they're connecting themselves to oppressed people across the US and across the globe. So I think that inspiration stands and is long lasting because they were wanted to make coalitions and to draw connections to themselves with other people, other oppressed people, other people who were disempowered and disenfranchised. And also, I want to say this. I mean, the outfit is amazing. So the pictures that we get, these beautiful Black people dressed in these amazing outfits, like we can't discount the visual power of some of this. And that's why the artist that we worked with for this book created this gorgeous collage on the front and the photography inside. So funny, I flipped through this book and I was like, this is the most beautiful book. I could have just been like, blah, blah, blah. I could have just like not said anything. And I mean, the pictures speak for themselves. But yeah, I think that is also part of it, that iconic. Oh yeah, you want to?
I wanted to jump in there because I can't find my notes, but I had that as a question, which was, do you think that style played a role in the Panthers, right? And I know this, I don't want to belittle it, but I do feel like for Black folks, style is part of your substance. And to see Black men and women in leather jackets with turtlenecks, with sunglasses, with guns, like you saw that, and it was almost like the Black young man or woman saying, I want to join the Black Army. How much of that style and that image was part of what drove the success of the Panthers in your mind? Because I ask, is there some of it that was more style than substance? And it'll go to some of the things you talked about later on in the book about what are the underpinnings of what they stood for, because there was no national like dialogue. So talk to me about the role of style over substance, or style compared to substance, or as part of the substance, if for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm. No, I think the quote unquote uniform was extraordinarily important. I taught a little class to, I want to say they were kindergartners. I sat in on my friend's class and we did a little Zoom, and then she asked her students, okay, so what did you learn? What do you remember about our session on the Panthers? And people said a few things, a free breakfast for kids. And one child was like, the outfits, he was really struck by the outfits and the berets and the shirts and the leather jackets. And I feel like we can't discount the visuals. And it makes me think of the party newspaper, the Black Panther, because that was a place where they controlled the media, which I think is really important. They controlled the words that were in that paper. So they controlled what was said about them. They controlled the imagery, the pictures, the illustrations, the drawings. And so I think a lot of people, their first introduction to the party was through that paper. And so they were looking at the visuals, they were looking at the words. And I think that was definitely part of it. The style was definitely a part of it. But I think it was a lot richer than that. And I found it really interesting as I was doing research that because it became so iconic, there was a point at which they were telling Panthers not to wear it because they were immediately identified and then were being targeted by the police. So people, to kind of escape the police were like taking their jackets off and really quickly kind of like taking the berets off. And then the police didn't know that they were part of the party and they could escape. So I think later, as it came to be associated with the party, it also became sort of like a double-edged sword. People were much easier to identify and then target.
I think that one of the things that we see in leadership oftentimes is the uniform. I think when you think of the Nation of Islam, right, and you think of the Fruit of Islam and how they present and what they do to help build the self-esteem of Black men who have often seen themselves depicted in lesser ways, I do think that the imagery and the iconicness of the imagery for both Black men and Black women being able to see their men in a certain way or a certain format played a significant role in it. I want to jump to college and the role of colleges, universities, and Black student unions were in the growth of this movement. And then kind of how that, because this movement really, I think oftentimes we think of these movements and probably from our mindset, we think of the standpoint of this happening in the context of maybe 30 or 40-year-olds, but these were like 21, 22, 23-year-olds. And talk to me about the role of colleges and universities and the controlling of these departments of Black studies and why they were so important in the growth and development of not just the Panthers, but other groups at the time.
So this was huge. And I think before I want to get into that, I do want to say I didn't realize how young a lot of the people were before I started really delving into the stories of the people. And I gained so much more respect and admiration for people. I mean, Lil Bobby Hutton was 17 when he was murdered. Like he didn't even get to be, he was still a teenager. And so I think sometimes people, because of the nature of this history, there was there was some pushback, right? How do you write a book for young adults on the Black Panther Party? And so my pushback to that is the people who lived it were young adults. So we're just going to tell the story like it is, right? To the best of our ability, because a lot of the people were young adults themselves. And like you're saying, people were in college or people were in high school. There were people agitating for Black Studies departments in their high schools. And I think this was part of a broader movement too. But the Panthers were really instrumental in a lot of places in trying to establish that and have like a Black Studies department and have a department where people could basically study their history. I think having representation is so important. And it's just so interesting, just even in like, because you have kids and I have a kid, even just in the kids' books that you can find now, right? Like who was represented in the kids' books however long, and like who is represented in the kids' books now. And so in terms of when you go to college, I don't know, I'm kind of a like question everything type person, but you go to college and all you're learning about is like Socrates. And no shade to Socrates, but like we also need things that are relevant to our present day. We need to see people who look like us, people who have similar experiences to us. And so I think that was part of it, is to have that representation in the colleges. And also, I mean, there was a little bit of a tension, I would say, because I mean, at Merritt College, Huey and Bobby were in certain groups and they kept kind of like dropping out of these groups and realizing they needed to form their own group, because they had this term armchair revolutionary. So people who like sit back and talk all this theory, but don't do anything. And so I think this was also a really interesting time in our history, because not only were they doing something, there were huge marches that were coming all across the country in different colleges. So this was a time where you had these huge marches, huge movements in college campuses in a way that I feel like was incredibly inspiring. And like, we don't really see it today in that way. This kind of upswell from young people, you know what I mean? People, like you're saying, 20, 21, 22, who are like taking to the streets to fight for what they want. And I think part of that too does have to do with the Vietnam War, because the Panthers had a strong, anti-war platform. And so that started sort of like cross-fertilization with other groups that were strongly anti-war. And the people who were in colleges were the people who could be drafted to go fight for the war.
One of the other things I think about though in the college conversation is that is where you become enlightened to, like, usually I think when you talk to a lot of young people who have been under or miseducated, when they get to a college or a university and they find out, and you talked about this a little bit earlier, about colonialism, and they find out about capitalism, and they find out about all of these isms and all of these things that have made them feel a certain way up until they get to college and they realize there's somebody else talking, whether it's revolutionary. And during this era of Black studies, I think we also saw people starting to not just rationalize what was happening to them in the past, but challenging the norms. And as these new professors were taking or coming into these universities, these departments were also arming these young people with the information and knowledge that they use to go out and fight in some ways. So as these educators started to take over, as these conscious educators started to infiltrate universities, they educated young revolutionaries who gave them the understanding that then gave them the pieces of their underpinnings that they went on. Because when does a young person from Oakland school system learn about Mao or learn about Che Guevara or learn about all of the people that they were starting to learn about and revolutions and revolutionary thought processes. And so I also think a lot of that started to happen in the college and the university era. I want to jump now into kind of the Panthers, because there were some unique personalities in the organization. Now, I always think of Huey P. Newton as the leader of the Black Panther Party, right? But he wasn't the chairman. Bobby Seale was the chairman, although it seems like everything that we know and learned and have ever heard about the Panthers really revolved around Huey Newton and the Free Huey campaign, which we'll talk about a little bit more extensively. Then we saw the entry of Eldridge Cleaver into the conversation, as well as a variety of other personalities. But I want you to talk to me about the unique dynamic that first existed between Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. And then after we go to that, then I want to talk about the introduction of Eldridge Cleaver. And then we're going to start to then add some of the other cast of characters and the role that they played in this kind of this organization, because it really becomes kind of a complex dichotomy when you think about how the Panthers evolved. So first, talk to me about Bobby and Huey and their relationship, and how is it that Bobby is like, I want to be like that guy, but Bobby becomes the chairman and Huey is the Minister of Defense.
Yeah, I do want to address when you said where would you learn that in the Oakland school about revolutionary thought. There were the Oakland community schools through the Panthers, and that's where you would learn that.
But they created that, right? And that's my point. So how, if you think about, this is where they're saying, when they get to college, they're saying, hey man, I'm learning this stuff, and they take it back to the schools and empower young people. But I think when you think about the role of the Oakland schools and the schools that the Panthers put, it was because there was a vacuum of knowledge for our young people that Huey and Bobby didn't have probably until they got to college.
Mm-hmm. And I was social studies and African American studies. So, I mean, definitely when I was in school, I was learning things that I didn't know, right? But it was because there was an African American studies department that I could be a part of. The whole education system thing, I could really go into that, and the way in which from the get-go, it's like there are divisions, people are made to feel inferior, people's different learning styles. It's just a whole kit and caboodle. And I think part of what they were trying to do with the Oakland community schools, and it wasn't just about what they were teaching. It was teaching people how to think, how to question, how to use the tools, right? I really think it's really important to talk about inquiry, right? To question, to inquire, rather than just take what you're given. Because if the Panthers had just taken what they were given, we would have no Black Panther Party. But so to get back to your question about the personality, I think this is complicated. People have different ideas. I see Huey, I see Huey as a person who was he didn't really want to do that much public speaking. He was more kind of like a theory type person, and he really enjoyed one-on-one. He wasn't like a big crowd person. And so you got Bobby, who's like a jazz drummer and like has been in plays and is more of a performer, right? So I have this little scene where they're on Telegraph and they're basically like, oh, like Bobby, recite the poem, right? So he gets up on the chair and he's reciting the poem. And so that's kind of like this dynamic, right? Like Huey's coming with the theory, he's looking at the law book and saying, okay, if we have our weapon and it's just like this and they can see it, this is legal. And so before the Mulford Act, which basically prohibited their strategy, made it illegal, there were no shots fired because they were working completely within the law, arming themselves. And so we've got this person who's kind of like the theoretician, basically. And then you got Bobby, who is more like, speaking in front of people. And then Eldridge brings this really interesting dynamic where he's written Soul on Ice. And then he's really working to put together the newspaper. And like, we know Eldridge enjoys speaking to large crowds. So we've got like kind of a constellation of people who I think really sort of fit well together. And Huey, I mean, through what I kind of looked at and studied and talking to my dad and Josh, Huey was like, we need Eldridge, right? And Bobby's kind of like, well, okay. I'll come along for it, basically. And I think that there ended up being a lot of tension. And there, there's a split that later happens. But I think part of what happened is everything grew so quickly. And sometimes people ask me about how this relates to Black Lives Matter movement. And it's really interesting because Black Lives Matter is specifically decentralized. So it's like there isn't this chairperson or this like one leader like that. And so I think part of the fractiousness and the way that things fell apart is there were people who were in these positions. Nobody was elected. People like named themselves the chairperson, or, it was that way. And so I think as the group grew, it was kind of like, well, is this person really representing my interests? And so I think that's part of what ended up happening is they had this structure that they created. And to be honest, I don't think they thought it was going to become as large as it did, as quickly as it did.
So let's jump into that just a little bit further. I think about Eldridge, Huey, and Bobby. And I think right when they finally kind of get the thing rolling and they got all the pieces in pieces in place, Huey gets snatched out. He goes to jail. And Eldridge builds a campaign around freeing Huey. I think we see it now. The remnants of it is free the guys, free them all, free anybody, free Tupac, free whoever it is, right? But I think the origins of that, the t-shirt, go back to the Free Huey campaign. It seems that Huey Newton became almost like a mythological figure, bigger than maybe he actually was or was prepared to be. Talk to me about what happens in this dynamic where, would it be safe to say that Huey Newton was the spiritual guy, like the spiritual, the spirit, like the soul of the organization? Would that be fair to say? Like essentially, like he's the kind of the motivator of all of them, or this thing that is created. Would you say that or no?
Yeah, I was working with actually a dynamic that a lot of people, not to give away too many of my secrets, but using like screenplays or, head, heart, and spirit kind of dynamic. And so, yeah, I definitely see that as an element. And I think part of what happened is, so he was locked away and he's fighting to stay alive. Like we don't know that he's not going to like die in prison. So the Free Huey campaign, so Kathleen and Eldridge really kind of spearheaded that campaign. And what ended up happening is he was away. Other people were doing the work. The organization was growing. And by the time he came out, the organization was different. He recognized it to some extent, but I think he quickly realized that it was very different. And so I think, people are wanting certain things. They're still maybe wanting armed self-defense, but the laws have changed and the times have changed. And so he came out and there was a certain rhetoric. And then after a little while, the rhetoric was shifting to maybe more community survival programs and these other things. And I think some people were like, but armed self-defense was our initial strategy, right? Like, why are we moving away from this? And I think that what the campaign did is, like you're saying, built him up into something that he as one human couldn't really sustain. And so he comes out and everyone's like, the revolution's going to happen. Like he's out, everything's going to change. And it didn't. And so I think there was a lot of kind of like, it was like deflation, right? But he's only one person. And so I think that the image that was kind of built up, I think the reason too that we think of him as the leader is because of that iconic picture of him in the throne, kind of like wingback. That whole
wicker chair.
Yeah.
The wicker chair with the zebra skin and the spear and the rifle, and every Black kid who goes to college and takes African American Studies 101 is like, I gotta get that picture, and they get the one with Malcolm X and that's when you go through your young revolutionary phase, because you have learned some self-awareness. But that picture is iconic in every, and I think so many people have done their own version of it, whether it is street organizations, whether it is rappers. There is some derivative of that sort of iconic picture that he put. So now tell me, there's 3 people in the universe, right? Well, actually there's more than 3 people now, because now the organization's gotten bigger. Talk to me about, and this is one of the things that I wonder, how does an organization that originated in Oakland grow all the way to Tupac's mama and Daruba bin Wahad? And how does an organization that was born on the West Coast then becomes so iconic to give us the Assata Shakurs of the world and the Fred Hamptons and Mark Clarks of the world? We saw this organization grow, but how are all these people connected?
I think as I was delving deeper into this, it was clear to me, and part of it I think is its strength, and part of it is why it fell apart, is that it was more like a constellation, right? It's not like it's a big umbrella organization. It's more like a constellation. And so people are taking the theory, they're taking the 10-point program, they're taking the practice, but then they're applying it to their local communities. And so I think that was one of the strengths of the community survival programs, is you're in a particular community, you're on the ground, and you say, okay, what we really need is the free breakfast program. And so we're feeding everybody. We really need a free busing program so people can go visit their people in prison. And so we've got a free busing program, or we've got, free clothes, free shoes, so people can, clothe themselves so they can go to work or go to school. So I think that, I didn't really realize this as much before I started doing this research. I was just like, oh, the Black Panther Party. But it was very much like a lot of different people in a lot of different places. And sometimes I feel like the connection, I don't want to say it was tenuous, but it was, there wasn't time to fly out to every, initially, Bobby's flying out to Seattle with Aaron Dixon, and then he's flying to places. But then, he's on trial for the Chicago 8, and people, and this is part of the program, right? Lock people up, get rid of them so that the party won't be able to sustain itself, right? But one of the really interesting things is the party grows exponentially, grows intensely during the periods of intense repression. You would think maybe, people are getting repressed and then that's going to squash it. But there was a lot of repression, and the party was growing and growing because of the message, and because people were identifying with it and thinking, okay, this is something worth fighting for, and this is something worth dying for. But I think that it was, in a lot of ways, it was hyper local. So you look at the Oakland party, it could be very different from a chapter somewhere else, like the New Haven chapter. And I think that's part of what happened when things were starting to go downhill, and then they wanted everyone to come to Oakland, for like Bobby for mayor and stuff. And people were kind of like, well, I don't know if I can get to Oakland. It started to disperse, and people were like, well, we're doing our thing in our community. Like, how are we all just going to go to Oakland? And I think it was a way to try to rally, but I think it didn't work in the way they intended, because it was so like each city and each place really had its own vibe, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And I know Sharon has given me the eye, because I know I've got a run of show that tells me that I got to kind of start wrapping this up. So I'm going to do one last question, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Sharon. Tell me, why do you think ultimately the Black Panther Party failed, and why does it still hold such a iconic place? I feel like there are still always attempts to revive it or some semblance of it. Tell me why.
So I would say that the Black Panther Party did not fail.
Okay.
Specifically because of what you're saying about how it still continues to inspire people, still continues to instruct people. We're still writing about them. We're still talking about them. These people, a lot of these people are still alive who fought and agitated and put their lives on the line for the party. And one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement read Black Against Empire, my dad and Josh's book, and was partially inspired to make the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I would say that the party in that iteration is no longer, but the spirit of the party still exists, clearly, because people are still inspired by it, and still we need Black freedom and Black liberation. So that's what I would say about that. But I think part of what ended up happening is it wasn't just about internal conflicts, which there were, but a changing context. You know, the Vietnam War was shifting, things were shifting in their historical context. And so I think that also had a role to play. And another thing is that people were quitting their jobs. They were dropping out of school. People were giving their everything to the party, and they were young people. But as they started having families of their own and kids or responsibilities, I think a lot of people, didn't have money. They couldn't support themselves and couldn't support their families. And so they were trying to figure out how to support themselves as individuals while also still fighting for Black liberation and Black freedom. And we can't discount the government repression. Like, it was very real. Fred Hampton was murdered in his bed. So that is also a very real thing. And people continued because they believed that what they were fighting for was that important. But we can't discount the effect that government repression had, and the effect that every day you wake up and you're not sure, you think it might be your last. Like, we can't discount that. And that's partly why the repression existed, because they wanted to take the party down.
Okay. Awesome. So I am going to get some questions from the chat now. How did they fund their breakfasts, and what lessons might we take from them for direct community support here in Chicago?
Okay. So they received a lot of donations, actually. So they would receive, I was just looking at this part of the book, but they received people, like the person who had the milk donated however much milk for the week, or the person who was like the meat person donated the meat or whatever. So there was a lot of it was actually through donations. It wasn't through purchasing the food themselves. And one really interesting thing is there was sort of like a school breakfast program kind of before this, but because of the Panthers Free Breakfast for Children program that we now all know that exists in schools, I think it really had a huge impact on that, and a huge impact on having that actually like the way that it is today. But I would say if we're going to get practical, I would say you go and you ask for donations, or you ask for the mommies and the aunties to get together, the PTA people or whoever, the school people, to get together and cook the food, because it's got to be grassroots like that, especially when you're starting out. But I would say going and trying to get donations. I also think, this is kind of an aside, but this is something I personally think about. It's not necessarily related to the Panthers, is growing your own food or having community gardens. And so then you can have access to that. And that's great for kids too, to learn about all kinds of things. Is you could start a community garden, and then people could eat from that and understand about that and about sustainability and what's, in what season. And I think that would actually be a really great way of having a community garden. And then you could have, in middle school, I had kitchen classes. So you could have the garden and then you could cook with the kids. So I think that's another aspect or way you could do that.
Okay. I see another question here. I know you're fond of this book, but do you have particular chapters or images that touch you the most? Is that for me? Is that for you, or is that for?
I don't know who that's for, but I
Who's
can
that for? You go first. I'll answer it too.
Okay, I can show a few of my favorite pictures. So I love this one. I don't know if you can see this.
I do. I like that one.
I love this picture. And there are so many, the pictures are just so beautiful. But let me see if I can find there. We did a whole thing where we talked about what pictures were going to go in the book. And there was one picture that I said, especially because it's for young adult readers, that I felt like had to be in there. So let me see if I can. Yeah, I don't know. This picture really speaks to me on a lot of different levels. But this is, let me see.
I like that one too. That's a good one.
Yeah. In terms of chapters, okay, yes. So I felt like I was really vibing in the chapter where you've got all these things are happening at once. Fred Hampton's murder, and then you've got the LA raid. And I just really felt like, as I was writing it, I felt like I could feel like the power and the poetry. So on that part, I felt like I was doing a good job. And the beta readers agreed. So I feel like for me, that might be my favorite, but that's a little bit also hard to say, because when I was writing about the murder of Fred Hampton, it was right around the time that George Floyd was murdered and Breonna Taylor. So it was super intense trying to write that part. And I had to step away from the book because I was like, I can't do this. I'm like too emotional right now. But it was so resonant with what was currently happening in the world that when I came back, I had more. I was like, okay, yeah, you have to write this because it's so relevant. But yeah, so I think that's like chapter 8 or something like that. But you should read the whole thing.
I read the whole book. Oh, you read the whole book. No, actually read the whole book. It is a good read and you will not be wanting to put it down. I think that the one that jumped out to me was the diverse support. And it's kind of, it's interesting because I thought of the Panthers and their desire for multiculturalism in some way, shape, or form, but I feel like that has been to our detriment long term, in that while they looked for diverse support, I feel like what has now happened is so many people have jumped into our group that the things that are our needs have been diluted tremendously. And so what now used to be reserved for issues that were reserved for Black people, because we have been so empathetic, they have now usurped us. And now on the totem pole of race and addressing issues of race, and it is now Black, white, Asian, Latino, people of color, BIPOC, LGBTQ, et cetera, which I think all of those groups have struggles, but I think our struggle has been kind of the template that has been used, and everyone else has kind of been able to move ahead in their space. And I look at the fights that we're still having, and all of those people that were in the bucket with us that they were asking to be part of the coalition, used the coalition, and then went on to participate in American society, and our guys died. So that kind of jumped out to me at that point. But I got it. And I feel like in college, we used to say a lot, like it's people of color. The earth is like 9 out of 10 people are of color, but I don't know that worked out the way that they intended it to work out. Because now you see the Asians are trying to keep us out of Harvard. And there's just a lot of just different things that have happened in that space. So that really jumped out to me as one of the things that we would look at. And Sharon, were there, let me see, there's more questions. What future projects do you have in store for media or the literary world? What you got coming?
Me?
Yes, you.
Oh, I don't know. Wait, me? Sneak peek? Well, I do have some things I'm working on, but I can't say anything until we know that they're coming out into the world.
Are you in the Marvel universe now?
I do have to say, like, to what you just said, I know there was this thing where people were saying Black Lives Matter, and then people were the clap back or whatever was all lives matter. I'm like, you're missing the point. It's not to the exclusion of other people that Black lives matter, but this is a particular issue for particular people. And so I think that that's part of what you're talking about. It's not about excluding other people. It's about shining and focusing very specifically on a specific thing and specific people. So I just wanted to put that out there. And also, sorry, it's not chapter 8. It's a different chapter. It was chapter 8 when I was working on it in a draft. So it's not chapter 8. Don't quote me on that. But in terms of things coming up, I don't know what's coming up, what's in the store. I am working on a screenplay. I'm working on some novels. I love to write. So I am working on a bunch of things, and we will see what makes it to the light of day. But yeah, I've got some things in the mix. We will see. I hope you get to see me again, having written something else.
I think that would be awesome. I think if it's anything like this one, we've got a lot to look forward to, because this was definitely a great book. I really had a great time reading it. Sharon, you asked if I have anything coming up. The Maze Jackson show is expanding kind of what we're going to be doing, but we want to create some very specific Black content around issues, not morning show format, but just one-on-one, having conversations like this. And getting into more in-depth as compared to just doing top-level stuff. So be on the lookout for some very poli-sci 103.
Right.
We did 101 and 102. Be on the lookout for poli-sci 103.
All right. So thank you. That's all the time we have for this evening. I want to thank our guest, Jetta Grace Martin, and moderator Maze Jackson for leading such an excellent discussion. The book is again called Freedom, the Story of the Black Panther Party. You can check it out at the Chicago Public Library. And we also encourage you to visit any of Chicago's independent bookstores to purchase a copy. Tonight's program will be available on the Chicago Public Library YouTube and Facebook pages. If you have friends who couldn't join us tonight, please invite them to watch it on demand. And please visit the Chicago Public website for many more upcoming virtual events at chipublib.org. Thank you to our speakers, technical staff, the Chicago Public Library Foundation, and everyone tuning in. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.